Can you hear me? Madam Director from AIT, Mr. Dean from Judicial Reform Foundation, and my colleague, Professor Zhou from the Human Rights Center at Soochow University. Greetings from Taipei, Professor Diamond. Professor Diamond, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you very much, ma'am.
We are indeed very fortunate to have you with us this morning, Professor Diamond, as our keynote speaker. My colleague and your audience in different parts of the world online will certainly agree with me that we could not have chosen better. Professor Diamond has studied and reflected on long Stanford University for rule Asia and threat in Taiwan. Effort enlarge it must be deeper in that our chance in peace with democratic to a better the success of speak. You had 30 minutes. I was told that you speak about 30 minutes, and I hope that we have plenty of time from the audience for comments and questions. Professor Diamond, please.
Great. Thank you, Mab. I appreciate your extremely kind introduction. And I can only say, as someone who considers you a personal friend, I miss you and I wish I could be with you, and I wish I could be in Taiwan now. And I really dearly look forward to the day when I can make another visit there, which I'm hoping will be in the next calendar year. Today, global resurgence, specific and what it means for the world.
I think we Professor resolve it.
Okay. See the slide. That's on your in the slides. So if you go, there's a quote, slide, please. The slides, because I'm supposed to be advancing.
We tend to think aside, just that you start your will work. That is the direction. And try it and it will work.
Now hear me? I think the problem is on your end because, okay.
All right. We would check it. We would check it right away.
Can you hear me now?
All right. Now we can hear you now. We can hear you now. Please proceed. Please.
Okay, so the next step is for the conference administrators to show the slides. Good, thank you very much. All right, so we can move to the next slide. I just want to let you read this quote from Hannah Arendt that, really it dates back from ancient times and it continues to the present, that the central defining struggle that determines all politics is the struggle between freedom and tyranny. And we have to keep bearing that in mind. And that very much defines the moment we're in. Next slide. I try to address this and a lot of the issues that I will speak to today in a book I published a couple years ago called Ill Winds. But the analysis here is updated from that book. Next slide. I want to stress to you 8 trends that have been sweeping the world over the last 10 to 15 years and have been gathering momentum in recent years. First of all, global levels of freedom and democracy have been declining. I think you're all aware of that. Second, we see in the world a deteriorating rule of law, even in many countries that call themselves democracies. Third, we see a wave of illiberal populism sweeping many of the democracies of the world, and in a number of cases, like Hungary and Turkey, causing the breakdown of democracy and the rise of authoritarian regimes and endangering other democracies. The fourth, which you have, I think, at least some experience of in Taiwan, but it's not nearly as bad there as it is in the US and in some other democracies, is the increasing level of polarization in politics, tension and enmity between political parties and intolerance of other points of view. The fifth factor is one that is making polarization, intolerance, and extremism worse, which is social media and its algorithms, which privilege outrageous and extreme dialogue and behavior. Sixth is the resurgence of powerful authoritarian regimes, including Russia and China, and the way they are penetrating our own democracies and including our social media. Seventh is the decay of democratic values, commitments, behavioral orientations, and trust, particularly in the United States, I'm sorry to say, but in some parts of Europe as well. And of course, you know that autocrats have used the pandemic to heighten their control over their societies. And Taiwan stands out as an admirable case of effective democratic management of the pandemic. Next slide. So what is causing the democratic recession and how can we measure it? I want to start by the what's happening and how to measure it, and then come to the why. Next slide. So what we have happening is that every class of regime in the world has been deteriorating over the last decade. Many democracies that, not all, but many democracies that we thought were fairly liberal and flourishing, or at least stable democracies, particularly the United States, but also several European democracies, including Poland, and some Latin American democracies, such as Brazil, have been at a minimum becoming less liberal under the weight of populist rulers, like you see here, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. Next slide. And then we have a number of electoral democracies that have been eroding and are at risk of a breakdown of democracy. Here you see the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, who has really been using Hindu chauvinism and outright bigotry against the Muslim minority to try and rally support behind his populist party and agenda. Next slide. Then you have electoral democracies that have been breaking down, including one fairly close to you, the Philippines, under the pressure of an authoritarian president, Duterte, and others that I think you're familiar with in Hungary, Turkey, and Bangladesh. Next slide. And then we have the competitive authoritarian regimes that have allowed historically for some space, some dissent, some political pluralism, but have now become effectively one-party dictatorships like Cambodia and Uganda, and their two leaders depicted here. Next slide. And then the authoritarian regimes you see here in Venezuela, China, Russia, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia have been becoming more ruthlessly authoritarian and more aggressive outside of their borders. Next slide. So all of this is making for a dangerous situation in which, if you look at the democracies of the world, the states above 1 million population that meet a test of democracy, it was continuously expanding during the so-called third wave of global democratization between 1974 and 2006, reaching 57% of all the independent states of the world that met the test of electoral democracy. And in the last 15 years, since 2006, you can see it's been in steady decline, and it's not horrible, but it's continuous. And we're now at a point where, once again, only a minority of states, over 1 million people, meet a test of electoral democracy. And the percentage of states that are liberal democracies has also been declining. Next slide. As Freedom House has indicated, we've been in a situation for the last 15 years in which levels of freedom in the world have been declining. Since 2008, in every year beginning then, only about 50 to 70% as many countries have been gaining in freedom as the number that have been declining. And last year was only 40%. And this really, as you can see, almost exactly reverses the pattern of the post-Cold War period between 1991 and 2005. Next slide. So how has this been done? What is the mechanism by which democracy has been slipping back and disappearing? It has not generally been through the familiar mechanism of a state of emergency, a military coup, an executive coup, or a sudden assault on democracy. It's been happening gradually through what I call creeping authoritarianism, often led by an illiberal or authoritarian populist ruler and party. Next slide. And you can see here some examples of that: the late Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Jaroslaw Kaczynski in Poland, the Law and Justice Party. Next slide. And these illiberal populists share a number of elements. They have a contempt for elites of all kinds and institutions more generally. They don't believe in political pluralism. They think there's only one way, one political path that's legitimate, only one political leader who can fix things. They believe in direct democracy by plebiscite and the empowerment of the leader rather than representative democracy. They tend to be very intolerant of ethnic and religious and racial minorities, and are very nationally chauvinistic and illiberal on the international stage. Next slide. They also move by stealth and incrementally to try and accumulate power and undermine the opposition. They begin by suggesting that the opposition party or parties are disloyal, illegitimate, don't really have a right to contest. When they come to power, they quickly try to undermine the independence of the courts and the mass media. And as you can see, over time, they go after other actors in civil society, universities, think tanks, the business community, which they try to turn into an extension of the ruling party. And eventually they take over three key areas of the state that then turn it from a democracy into an authoritarian regime. One is the professional civil service or bureaucracy of the state. The second is the security and intelligence apparatus. And the third, of course, is the electoral administration, so that they can announce whatever election results they want to. Next slide. Next slide. So the question is, why has this been happening? What have been the drivers of it? Next slide. And to summarize, it really involves a mix of factors. Weak political institutions in a lot of these countries that cannot guarantee a rule of law. Pressure from globalization and the advanced industrial democracies, particularly immigration pressure in Europe and the United States, that's leading to a cultural backlash. I've mentioned the problem of social media and the way it's driving disinformation, polarization, citizen alienation, and distrust. Unfortunately, there is some truth to what Chinese propaganda is saying, that some Western democracies have appeared to be in decline in their power, their resolve, and their authenticity as democracies. It is ludicrous to suggest that China is in any way a democracy. It's a farcical claim, but it's certainly a rising power. Now, China has its own deep economic and structural contradictions, as Russia does, but it is accumulating and projecting more geopolitical power, more united front penetration, more intimidation, and so on. And just everything has gotten worse in the pandemic. Next slide. I have here some of the ways that the pandemic has empowered autocrats and make things worse. I'll be happy to share these slides with you or have the Judicial Reform Foundation do so, so you can study these in more detail. Next slide. And so we respect to China. It's relentless on stage as of increasingly power and influence. It's been the rapid which now is numbered by ships than the United. It's not only Are you able to hear me now? All right, can you advance the slide, please? So we have a Russian information war on American democracy that I think you're well familiar with. Next slide. And most alarmingly, we have very significant Chinese influence operations against our democracies, both in Taiwan and in Australia, Europe, the United States, and so on, that has infiltrated our media and is trying to spread Chinese propaganda. I'm a little bit less concerned about the Confucius Institutes. I don't think they've been a very effective mechanism of influence, but the entire relationship with universities has been meant, and with other institutions in civil society, local government, and elsewhere, to control the narrative and censor or silence views that are critical of China on Xinjiang, on Tibet, on Hong Kong, on Taiwan, on their social credit system, their grotesque repression of their own population. They just want control, control, control. Next slide. And they are becoming more brazen in projecting their power, as you know, through the Belt and Road Initiative, the militarization of the South China Sea, their efforts to gain control of critical infrastructure, farmland, ports, and so on, and their ominous efforts to gain control of supply chains, both of raw materials and eventually, I think their goal is of semiconductors, so they can hold developed countries and others hostage to their global ambitions. Next slide. So what does China want? Next slide. In a word, I think dominance. First of all, dominance in East Asia and the Indo-Pacific region, and then I think it wants to be the dominant power in the world, and it's in the process of developing a central bank digital currency that it hopes someday can displace the dollar as the world's premier currency of reserve and exchange. Next slide. It's very important to recall the work of Sun Tzu that the best way to win a war is to not have to fight it, to subdue the enemy without fighting. And a lot of the United Front activity and the global sharp power penetration of Australia, Japan, the United States, and Europe, and other countries in Asia, and of course, ultimately Taiwan, is to achieve that victory without actually having to fire a shot. Next slide. There's a lot of psychological warfare involved here. You can read these ridiculous quotes from the PRC propaganda machine trying to capitalize on the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and constantly trashing the efficacy, will, and character of the world's democracies, including in their two recent propaganda pieces on democracy. Next slide. So when I say they want to control the narrative, what they want to do is shape US and global understanding in a way that will be favorable to them and silence criticism of all their policies, including the crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, and before that in Tibet, and the tens of millions that Mao killed through famine and so on, and the ongoing human rights catastrophe that is Chinese communist rule on the mainland, and now the vast number of political prisoners in Hong Kong. And of course, there isn't enough time in your conference to document all of these atrocities. Next slide. So a lot of this is a censoring of criticism, and I have been alarmed to see the way that people draw back out of understandable fear of never being able to get a visa to go to China again if you're a China scholar, fear of not being able to do business in the mainland, and a cynical exploitation of family ties, calling in, browbeating, psychologically torturing, and threatening family members to try to get them to get their relatives abroad to be silent or constrain their criticism of the Chinese Communist Party state. Next slide. They are launched upon a 3-decade-long campaign to acquire all kinds of Western technology and supercharge their own efforts to gain dominance in a variety of fields, perhaps the most consequential of which is the race to lead in artificial intelligence. But as you can see, there are so many other dimensions here. And this requires a very careful and discriminating approach by the Western democracies in terms of the transfer and sharing of technology and even joint research to make sure we are not feeding the machine of civil military fusion. Next slide. Next slide. They're going after data, and you've seen the assault of the Chinese Communist Party state on the big data companies like Tencent and Alibaba. They want control, and they want control over data for two reasons. Number one, Data is the new oil. Data is power. And he who or it who controls data will have enormous power over individuals and societies. And it will enable them to exercise leverage over us as individuals, leverage over us as societies, and will enable them to train their machine learning techniques to turbocharge their artificial intelligence in the race to have the world's most powerful machines. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is that we not allow the neo-totalitarian Chinese Communist Party state to gain control of our personal and societal data and use it to build profiles on us, to eclipse our freedom, and to acquire the most powerful forms of artificial intelligence in the world. This is an area where we need to be extremely vigilant. Next slide. Ultimately, their method is to disarm and discredit resistance. One of the ways they're doing it now is by playing on the understandable and legitimate fears of Chinese Americans in the United States and more broadly Asian Americans. They're doing this as well in Australia and New Zealand, to a lesser extent in Europe, that this is just a new form of racism. And that any effort to promote vigilance and concern about united front penetration of our institutions and co-optation of individuals, and not just Chinese Americans, but a variety of others as well, is just racism and bigotry against rising non-Western power. This is cynical, it's ludicrous, it's a diversion. It had an impact in trying to disarm, discredit, and preempt resistance to their relentless drive for neo-totalitarian dominance, not only over their own society, but increasingly over other parts of the world. Next slide. So I think I should probably stop around here, just go through these slides very quickly. We need a new policy posture that's going to mobilize very significant vigilance with respect to research and technology to make sure that they don't corrupt, penetrate, and co-opt our most important and sensitive lines of technological research. Next slide. I think we should pay a lot of attention to culture and the way they're trying to distort, censor, and control culture in terms of Hollywood and elsewhere. But I'm just going to close with this because it's already 6:10 and we've lost a lot of time. Let me just say in closing, and then we can end the slide sharing. We, the democracies of the world, and this means Taiwan, Japan, Australia, I would say India, and so the United States, I've mentioned the Quad partners, the United Kingdom, the rest of Europe. We need to be very vigilant and very alert to the tactics that China is using, both the overt campaign of military intimidation and expansion in the South China Sea and elsewhere, the increasing arrogant entry and bullying entry into Taiwan's air identification zone, aiming to grind down our will and resistance and dominate. But we also need to be very alert to the undeclared, subtle, covert, coercive, and corrupting tactics of United Front penetration that are trying to disarm and preempt our will to balance off against and restrain China's authoritarian effort to dominate the region and absorb Taiwan and turn back the cause of freedom in the world. At this point, I want to stop, and hopefully we can have some time for dialogue. Thank you.